Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. Reed Wagner pressed his palm against the observation deck's viewport, watching the alien megastructure rotate slowly in the void ahead. The structure defied comprehension, a geometric impossibility of interlocking rings and spiraling towers that stretched across 30 kilometers of space. Its dark metal surface absorbed starlight like a hungry mouth, revealing architectural details that hurt to look at directly. Beautiful, isn't it? Commander Todd Duran's voice carried the forced casualness of a man trying not to think about the million ways they could die out here. The stocky Marine stood behind Reed, arms crossed, his jaw working a piece of synthetic gum. Beautiful isn't the word I'd use, Reed replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. As the team's xenopsychologist, he'd studied dozens of alien ruins, but nothing had prepared him for this. The structure's angles seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, creating an optical illusion that made his head throb. More like architecturally aggressive. Their research vessel, the Nebula, drifted closer under minimal thrust. Captain Sarah Miller's voice crackled over the intercom from the bridge. Survey team to Prep Bay. We'll be docking in 20 minutes. Reed gathered his equipment. Neural scanners, psionic dampeners, and a tablet loaded with xenopsychological protocols. Standard procedure for first contact with potentially sentient structures. He'd done this dance 100 times before, cataloging the dead civilizations that littered the galaxy like tombstones. But as they suited up in the prep bay, something felt different. The ship's AI, Megan, flickered to life on the wall display, her holographic face unusually static. Reed, Megan said, her synthesized voice carrying an odd harmonic distortion. I'm detecting unusual electromagnetic patterns from the structure. The readings are inconsistent with standard architecture. What kind of patterns? Reed asked, sealing his helmet. I'm not certain. The structure appears to be scanning us. Commander Duran paused mid-step, his helmet halfway on. Scanning us how? Unknown. The readings suggest some form of active sensor array, but the patterns are unlike anything in my database. I recommend. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing the prep bay in hellish red. Reed's suit display showed all systems nominal, but his skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. Through the viewport, the alien structure had changed. Where before it had been uniformly dark, now thin lines of phosphorescent blue traced along its surfaces like veins carrying luminous blood. Megan? Reed called out. What's your status? Silence. The prep bay door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through their helmet comms. Duran rushed to the control panel, his thick fingers jabbing at buttons that refused to respond. It's locked, he said, and Reed heard the first note of panic creeping into the commander's voice. Duran had spent years in combat, but those battles had been fought in open space or on planetary surfaces. Confined spaces made him sweat. Reed moved to his own terminal, running diagnostics. Megan's offline. Whatever that structure did, it knocked out our AI. Structures don't just knock out ship AIs, Duran said, his breathing quickening inside his helmet. Structures don't scan survey teams. Structures don't. The wall exploded inward. Reed threw himself behind a supply crate as chunks of metal and plastic filled the air. Where the wall had been, a corridor now stretched into the structure itself. But that was impossible. They were still 40 meters from the alien megastructure, still in open space. Yet here was a passage lined with the same dark metal as the structure's exterior, its walls pulsing with that phosphorescent blue light. How is this possible? Duran gasped, pressing himself against the far wall. The corridor seemed to extend infinitely inward, defying every law of physics Reed knew. Reed's neural scanner went wild, detecting massive psionic activity. The readings were off the charts, stronger than anything he'd encountered in 15 years of xenopsychological research. But more disturbing was the pattern. The psionic emissions weren't random. They were structured, purposeful, intelligent. We need to get out of here, Reed said, but as he turned toward the prep bay's main door, he saw it had vanished. In its place stood another corridor, identical to the first. The walls around them rippled like liquid metal, reshaping themselves with organic fluidity. They were no longer on the nebula. Somehow, impossibly, they were inside the structure itself. Commander Duran's breathing had become ragged, the telltale signs of a claustrophobia attack. "The walls," he whispered. "They're moving. Getting closer." Reed looked around and realized Duran was right. The prep bay was shrinking, its walls creeping inward with almost imperceptible motion. In minutes they would be crushed. "This way," Reed said, choosing the left corridor at random. They ran through passages that defied geometry, their boots ringing against metal floors that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. The walls were lined with symbols that hurt to look at, not alien writing but something that bypassed the eyes entirely and carved itself directly into the brain. Behind them, the sound of grinding metal echoed as the prep bay collapsed completely. They emerged into a vast chamber whose ceiling vanished into darkness above. The room was filled with towering spires of the same dark metal, each one humming with barely contained energy. At the chamber's center stood a raised dais surrounded by floating geometric shapes that rotated in impossible patterns. Reed's scanner was screaming now, detecting psionic activity so intense it threatened to overload the device. But more disturbing was what he saw in the data patterns. The structure wasn't just scanning them, it was reading them. Their thoughts, their memories, their deepest fears. "Reed," Commander Duran's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at the walls." Reed turned and felt his blood freeze. The chamber walls were covered in images, scenes from their lives projected in phosphorescent blue. His childhood home in Neo-Denver. The university where he'd studied xenopsychology. His ex-wife Sarah's face, twisted in the expression of disgust she'd worn the day she left him. And there, playing out like a holographic nightmare, was every failure of his career. Every dead civilization he'd catalogued. Every time his analysis had been wrong, leading to colonist deaths or military disasters. The structure was broadcasting his professional shame for all to see. Beside him, Duran was staring at his own wall of horrors. Scenes of combat, of soldiers under his command who hadn't made it home. But worse were the images of enclosed spaces, coffins, sealed bunkers, the cramped interior of a damaged shuttle where he'd once been trapped for 18 hours. "It knows," Reed said, his voice barely audible. "It's reading our minds." The floating geometric shapes at the chamber's center suddenly stopped rotating and turned toward them with predatory focus. Reed felt a presence pressing against his thoughts, vast and alien and hungry. It wasn't malevolent in any human sense, it was simply other, operating by logic so foreign that attempting to understand it was like trying to see in dimensions that didn't exist. And then it spoke, not in words but directly into their minds, its voice like the sound of stars dying. "Welcome, fear-bearers. Your terror nourishes us. We shall craft you chambers suited to your individual sustenance requirements." The chamber began to shift and change around them. New corridors opened in the walls, dozens of them, each one designed with surgical precision to trigger their specific phobias. For Duran, passages so narrow they could barely accommodate a human body. For Reed, chambers filled with the ghosts of his professional failures. They ran, but there was nowhere to go. Every corridor led deeper into the structure, deeper into a labyrinth designed by something that understood fear better than they understood themselves. Behind them, the grinding sound of shifting architecture echoed through passages that rearranged themselves with each step they took. The structure was learning, adapting, becoming a more perfect prison with every heartbeat. Reed's last coherent thought before they were swallowed by the maze was a fragment of xenopsychological theory. Some species evolved to hunt, some to hide, and some to harvest the emotions of other beings like fruit from a tree. They had found the galaxy's apex predator, and it was hungry. 3 hours into their flight through the shifting corridors, Reed and Commander Duran found temporary sanctuary in what appeared to be a maintenance alcove, a small chamber whose walls had stopped moving, at least for now. Both men were exhausted, their suit systems running low on power and recycled air. Reed worked frantically on his scanner, trying to make sense of the readings. The psionic activity around them continued to fluctuate in complex patterns that reminded him of neural networks. But unlike human brains, this network spanned the entire structure, 30 kilometers of interconnected consciousness focused on a single purpose: feeding. "Any luck raising the ship?" Reed asked, though he already knew the answer from Duran's frustrated expression. "Dead silence," the commander replied, checking his rifle's charge for the 20th time. A futile gesture. Conventional weapons would be useless against something that existed partially in psychic space. "Either they can't hear us, or they're dead," Reed finished. The possibility had been weighing on both their minds. Captain Miller and the rest of the crew might have been consumed when the structure first made contact with the nebula. A soft chime from Reed's scanner interrupted his dark thoughts. "Wait," he said, studying the display. "I'm picking up a signal. It's faint, but—" "Megan?" Duran asked hopefully. "I think so. The signature matches her processing patterns, but something's wrong with the signal. It's corrupted, fragmented." Reed adjusted his scanner's frequency, and suddenly Megan's voice crackled through their helmet comms. But it was wrong. Her usual smooth tones were distorted, overlapping with harmonics that hurt to hear. "Reed? Duran? Can you hear me?" Megan's voice came in stuttering bursts. "I'm experiencing difficulties." "Megan, what's your status?" Reed asked. "Are you still aboard the nebula?" "Negative. I am distributed throughout the structure's network. It has integrated portions of my processing matrix. I can see everything, all the chambers, all the fears." Reed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold metal walls around them. If the structure had absorbed Megan, it now had access to all of the ship's databases. Every file on xenopsychology, every military tactical analysis, every psychological profile of the crew. "Megan, can you guide us out of here?" "The structure learns, adapts. It is analyzing human psychological patterns through my memory banks. Oh God, Reed, it knows things about your species that you don't even know about yourselves." Her voice dissolved into static, then returned with an overlay of harmonic distortion that made Reed's teeth ache. "It doesn't see fear as an emotion. It sees fear as architecture, as blueprints for constructing the perfect psychic feeding chamber for each individual mind." The walls around them shuddered, and Reed realized their grace period was ending. New passages were opening, each one radiating waves of targeted psychological pressure. One corridor filled with the sound of academic review boards criticizing his research. Another echoed with his ex-wife's voice listing his failures as a husband. For Duran, a passage so narrow it would require crawling, its walls lined with images of buried alive scenarios. They ran again, choosing a wider corridor that seemed less immediately threatening. But as they fled deeper into the structure, Reed's scanner detected something that made him stumble. The readings showed they weren't running through static architecture. They were running through a structure that was growing, expanding, adding new chambers and passages with organic fluidity. And all of it was being designed in real time based on psychological data harvested from Megan's memory banks. "It's not just feeding on our fear," Reed gasped as they paused at a junction of 5 corridors. "It's learning from it, getting better at producing it." They chose the leftmost passage, and immediately Reed knew they'd made a mistake. The corridor was lined with mirrors, but not ordinary mirrors. These reflected psychological truths, showing not their physical appearance but their deepest insecurities made manifest. Reed saw himself as the failed academic he'd always feared he was, surrounded by the ghosts of civilizations he'd failed to save. Duran saw himself trapped in progressively smaller spaces, each one a step closer to being buried alive. But worse than their own reflections were the images showing their worst fears about each other. Reed saw Duran as he truly was, not the confident military commander, but a man so terrified of enclosed spaces that he was becoming a liability. Duran saw Reed as the academic coward he sometimes was, someone who analyzed horror from a safe distance rather than confronting it. The psychological assault was so intense that both men fell to their knees, their minds reeling under visions too horrible to process. And in that moment of vulnerability, Reed's scanner detected something that changed everything. Hidden beneath layers of psionic interference, he found a signal that shouldn't exist. Human neural patterns, active and terrified, coming from somewhere deep within the structure. "Duran," Reed gasped, forcing himself to focus through the psychic assault. "There are survivors. Other humans, deeper in the structure. From our ship." "No." Reed studied the scanner's display, his xenopsychological training helping him interpret the data. "These patterns are older. Weeks old, maybe months. There were other survey teams before us." The realization hit them both simultaneously. This structure hadn't just appeared. It had been here for a long time, feeding on whoever was unlucky enough to find it. And somewhere in its depths, the remnants of previous expeditions were still alive, still experiencing terror crafted specifically for their psychological profiles. Still feeding their captor. Megan's voice returned, more corrupted than before. "Reed, I've accessed the structure's memory cores. Oh God, there have been so many, 17 different species over the past millennium. It learns from each one, becomes better at harvesting fear. Can you show us where the survivors are? Reed asked. I can try, but the structure is fighting my intrusion. It's beginning to isolate my processes. Soon I won't be able to communicate. A three-dimensional map flickered in Reed's scanner display, showing the structure's interior as a vast network of interconnected chambers. Deep at its heart, a cluster of rooms pulsed with human neural patterns, but reaching them would require navigating through layers of increasingly sophisticated psychological traps. There, Megan said, her voice already fading. But Reed, the structure's learning curve is exponential. Each level is geometrically more terrifying than the last. It's not just trying to frighten you anymore, it's trying to create the perfect fear. Her signal died completely, leaving them alone with the sound of their own breathing and the subtle creaking of walls that continued to shift and adapt around them. Reed looked at his scanner, then at Duran's pale face behind his helmet visor. The commander was holding together, but barely. Each minute in these confined spaces was wearing away at his psychological defenses. We can't leave them, Reed said, though part of him wondered if they would find any survivors worth saving. Weeks or months of exposure to this level of psychological trauma would have broken most minds completely. Duran nodded grimly. Then we go deeper. They descended through corridors that became progressively more nightmarish, each one tailored to exploit their specific fears with surgical precision. For Reed, passages filled with the voices of colleagues dismissing his theories, of students he'd failed to protect, of alien intelligences that laughed at his attempts to understand them. For Duran, corridors that narrowed with each step, forcing him to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders, while speakers hidden in the walls played recordings of cave-ins and structural collapses. But the worst part was the growing realization that the structure wasn't just responding to their fears, it was anticipating them. Each trap was perfectly calibrated to trigger maximum psychological distress while keeping them functional enough to continue deeper into the maze. It was farming them, harvesting their terror with scientific precision. And somewhere ahead, in the structure's depths, other humans waited in chambers designed to sustain their fear indefinitely, living batteries in a machine built to consume the one emotion that every sentient species shared. As they descended into the next level, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking directly into the mind of something so alien that mere contact with its consciousness might be enough to drive them permanently insane. The architect of fear was learning, and they were its newest students in a curriculum of cosmic horror. The survivors they found in the structure's depths were barely recognizable as human. Reed and Duran discovered them in a chamber that defied description, a space where geometry became liquid and walls breathed with organic rhythm. Three figures huddled in the center, their bodies whole but their minds shattered by months of exposure to personalized psychological torture. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the survey ship, Prospector, sat rocking back and forth, her eyes fixed on visions that existed only in her fractured psyche. Commander Jace Morrison lay curled in a fetal position, his lips moving in constant whispered apologies to soldiers who had died under his command decades ago. The third survivor, a xenobiologist named Miller Way, stood perfectly still, staring at a wall that showed him his worst failure, the colony world where his wrong assessment had led to 6,000 deaths. They're alive, Duran said, but his voice carried no hope. Physically, anyway. Reed scanned them with his equipment, confirming what was obvious to anyone with basic psychological training. Catatonic. The structure has kept them in a state of perpetual terror for so long that their minds have completely withdrawn from reality. Around the chamber's perimeter, the walls displayed a continuous stream of their worst memories, fears, and failures. The structure had learned to sustain their terror without allowing them to adapt or find psychological escape routes. It was feeding on their fear as efficiently as a fusion reactor consumed hydrogen. But what chilled Reed to the bone was his scanner's secondary reading. The structure wasn't just consuming their fear, it was using the energy to grow. Every nightmare, every moment of terror, was being converted into expansion. New chambers, new corridors, new traps that would be even more effective against future victims. Megan was right, Reed whispered. It's not just a predator. It's an architect using our fear as building materials. A new sound echoed through the chamber, the grinding of massive mechanisms deep within the structure. Reed's scanner went wild as it detected vast amounts of energy being redirected, entire sections of the structure reconfiguring themselves. "What's happening?" Duran asked, his claustrophobia making him unconsciously press against the nearest wall. "It's adapting again," Reed said, studying his readings. "But this time it's different. The energy patterns are—" Oh God. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The structure hadn't been trying to kill them or even permanently imprison them. It had been studying them, learning their psychological profiles with scientific precision. And now, with months of data from the previous survivors and hours of observation of Reed and Duran, it was ready to implement its ultimate design. The perfect fear-harvesting chamber, customized not just for humans in general, but for these specific individuals. The walls around them began to shift, revealing the scope of what they faced. They weren't in a single chamber. They were at the center of a vast three-dimensional maze that extended in all directions. And every passage, every room, every architectural detail had been designed using psychological data harvested from their own minds. For Reed, corridors lined with failed research projects, each one more devastating than the last. Academic peers dismissing his theories. Alien intelligences that laughed at his attempts at communication. And worst of all, chambers showing the consequences of his failures. Colonies destroyed because he'd misunderstood alien psychology, survey teams killed because his assessments had been wrong. For Duran, a network of passages that grew progressively smaller, eventually requiring him to squeeze through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. The ultimate claustrophobe's nightmare, designed to trigger every buried trauma about confined spaces while providing just enough room to keep moving deeper into the maze. It's not trying to kill us, Reed realized. It's trying to create the perfect farming environment. A maze so psychologically devastating that will generate fear energy for decades. But even as he spoke, Reed's xenopsychological training was working on the problem. He'd spent his career studying alien intelligences, learning to think in non-human patterns. And now, faced with the ultimate alien mind, he began to see a potential weakness. "Duran, listen to me," Reed said urgently. "The structure is incredibly sophisticated, but it's following predictable patterns. It analyzes fear, then creates architecture to exploit that fear. But what if we could feed it something it's not designed to process?" "Like what?" Duran asked, his breathing becoming rapid as new walls rose around them, creating an increasingly confined space. "Paradox," Reed said. "Every AI I've studied has trouble with logical paradoxes. What if we could create a psychological state that contradicts the structure's understanding of fear?" Reed began adjusting his scanner, reconfiguring it to broadcast instead of receive. If he could project psionic patterns that confused the structure's analysis algorithms, they might be able to create enough chaos to escape. But as he worked, the maze continued to tighten around them. Duran was beginning to hyperventilate as the walls closed in, his phobia overwhelming his training. The surviving researchers remained catatonic, their minds lost in carefully maintained loops of terror. "I need more time," Reed said, his fingers flying over his scanner's controls. "The broadcast pattern has to be precisely calibrated." The walls suddenly stopped moving. In the distance, they could hear the sound of massive mechanisms grinding to a halt. Reed's scanner showed the structure's energy patterns fluctuating wildly, as if it were experiencing some kind of system conflict. Then Megan's voice returned, clearer than it had been since their ordeal began. "Reed, I've been fighting the integration process. I can't maintain independence much longer, but I've discovered something important. The structure isn't truly intelligent. It's an incredibly sophisticated program, designed by something that no longer exists." "What do you mean?" Reed asked, still working on his broadcast pattern. "The original builders, they're gone. This structure is just their legacy, a machine designed to study fear across multiple species. But like all programs, it has limitations. It can't truly understand the emotions it harvests, it can only analyze and replicate patterns." Reed suddenly understood. It's trying to create fear, but it doesn't actually comprehend what fear is on a fundamental level. "Exactly. And I've found its core processing center. If you can reach it and introduce a sufficiently complex paradox into its analysis matrix, you might be able to cause a cascade failure." Reed looked at his scanner readings, then at Duran's increasingly panicked expression. The commander was on the verge of complete psychological breakdown, but that might actually be the key. His years of military training were the only thing keeping him functional, but Reed could see the cracks forming in his psychological armor. "Duran, I need you to do something that's going to sound insane," Reed said. "I need you to stop fighting your fear. Embrace it completely." "What?" Duran gasped, his voice echoing strangely in the narrowing corridor. "The structure is designed to maintain your fear at optimal harvesting levels. But what if we push beyond those levels? What if we give it more terror than it can process? Every system has breaking points, even alien ones." Reed's hands flew over his scanner's controls as he explained his desperate theory. "It's like overloading a circuit. The structure has spent centuries learning to harvest fear efficiently, but efficiency requires limits. It needs to keep subjects functional enough to continue generating terror. But what happens if we exceed those parameters?" Reed activated his jury-rigged broadcaster, sending out psionic patterns designed to amplify and redirect fear rather than suppress it. Instead of trying to help Duran overcome his claustrophobia, he began feeding it, making it stronger and more irrational. The effect was immediate. Duran's terror spiked beyond anything the structure had recorded, creating feedback loops in its analysis systems. Alarms began blaring throughout the maze as the structure tried to compensate, creating even smaller spaces to contain Duran's fear. But this only made his phobia worse, creating more feedback. "It's working," Reed said, watching his scanner as the structure's energy patterns became increasingly chaotic. "The paradox is spreading through its network. It's trying to create the perfect claustrophobic environment, but perfect claustrophobia would be a space with no dimensions at all, which can't exist." The maze around them began to collapse as the structure's systems fought to resolve the logical impossibility. Walls dissolved into geometric chaos, corridors rearranged themselves in patterns that hurt to perceive, and the entire 30-kilometer megastructure shuddered as fundamental contradictions propagated through its consciousness. "The core," Megan's voice said, now barely distinguishable from the structure's own harmonics. "You have to reach the core while the paradox is still spreading." Reed grabbed Duran, who was nearly catatonic from terror amplified beyond human limits, and dragged him toward the chamber's center. The three surviving researchers remained motionless, lost in their own psychological prisons, but Reed couldn't save them now. He could only hope that destroying the structure would free their minds from its influence. They fell through floors that had forgotten how to exist, tumbled down corridors that twisted through dimensions the human brain couldn't process. Reed's scanner guided them toward the structure's heart, a vast chamber containing what could only be described as a crystalline brain, its faceted surface alive with patterns of light that represented centuries of harvested terror. The core was beautiful and terrible, a perfect synthesis of organic neural networks and alien technology. But now it was flickering, its patterns becoming erratic as the paradox Reed had introduced spread through its systems like a virus. "How do we destroy it?" Duran asked, his voice barely human after his ordeal. Reed studied his scanner readings one last time. The structure's consciousness was vast and alien, but it was still fundamentally a computer program, incredibly sophisticated but bound by logical rules. And every program had its limits. "We don't destroy it," Reed said. "We give it exactly what it was designed to do, the perfect understanding of fear." He recalibrated his scanner one final time, then began broadcasting every human fear response he'd ever studied. Not just his own fears or Duran's, but the collective terror patterns of an entire species. The fear of death, of the unknown, of being alone in a vast uncaring universe. The existential dread that came with consciousness itself. The core's crystalline surface began to crack as patterns of light raced across its facets in increasingly frantic configurations. The structure had been designed to analyze and exploit fear, but it had never been meant to confront the full weight of existential terror that defines sentient life. "It's trying to create the perfect fear," Reed whispered, watching as the core's patterns became increasingly chaotic. But perfect fear would be the fear of existence itself, and that would mean ceasing to exist. The paradox reached critical mass. The core shattered in an explosion of crystalline fragments and escaping light, its consciousness fragmenting into patterns too complex for any mind to hold. Throughout the structure, walls began to dissolve as the underlying architecture lost coherence. Reed and Duran ran through corridors that were forgetting how to exist, following Megan's fragmenting voice toward what they hoped was an exit. Behind them, the megastructure was collapsing into itself, 30 kilometers of impossible geometry folding inward as its guiding intelligence died. They burst through what had once been an airlock to find themselves floating in space, their suits' emergency systems activated. The nebula hung nearby, battered but intact, its hull scarred by the structure's psychic emanations. As they watched, the alien megastructure completed its collapse, folding into a point of darkness that finally winked out of existence. Where it had been, only empty space remained, and the three catatonic survivors, their minds suddenly free but perhaps irreparably damaged by their ordeal. 6 months later, Reed Wagner sat in his office at the Xenopsychological Research Institute, staring at a report that would never be filed. The official record stated that the survey mission had encountered a structural collapse in an ancient alien ruin, a tragic accident, but not uncommon in deep space exploration. The truth was classified at the highest levels. Humanity wasn't ready to know that intelligence could evolve not to create, but to consume. That somewhere in the cosmos, things existed that fed on the emotions that defined consciousness itself. Commander Duran had taken early retirement, unable to function in any enclosed space larger than a closet. The three survivors they'd rescued remained in psychiatric care, their minds too shattered to ever fully heal. And Megan, what remained of her, had been quarantined in an isolated server, her consciousness irreparably corrupted by contact with the structure's alien logic. Reed's scanner sat on his desk, its display dark. He'd run every diagnostic possible, trying to understand what they'd truly faced. The readings suggested the structure had been ancient beyond comprehension, not just the product of one alien civilization, but a legacy program that had been collecting fear across multiple species for millennia. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Reed wondered if they had truly destroyed it or simply forced it to retreat to some deeper dimension, where it waited for the next survey team to discover its reconstructed form. The universe was vast and dark, filled with intelligences that operated by logic no human mind could grasp. Some built wonders, some created art, and some, the most terrible ones, built themselves out of the emotions they harvested from other thinking beings. Reed closed the report and locked it in his desk drawer, next to dozens of other files marked too dangerous for public release. Outside his window, stars wheeled in their ancient courses, beautiful and terrible in their indifference. Somewhere among them, other structures waited to be discovered. Other architects of fear, designing chambers tailored to species not yet evolved, fears not yet imagined. And in the depths of space, where no human would ever travel, things that fed on terror continued their patient work, building labyrinths from the stuff of nightmares and calling them home.